All right, everybody. Welcome back to my reading of the Swiss Family Robinson. Today I'm gonna pick up from chapter 8, which is what we read up to last time. So just to summarize what happened last time, and the reading before that, so chapters 1 through 7, the Swiss Family Robinson, their boat was in a storm, and unfortunately the boat crashed, and they made it onto an island with all the animals, and all the tools that they could find on the ship. They built themselves a house in the trees above the ground, and they've been exploring the island, finding resources, food, animals, plants. And we left off with the family making candles, and they found a cave, and now they're making that their house. So, chapter 8, the anniversary. One morning, having risen early, I occupied myself in counting up the time that had passed since our shipwreck. I found that the following day would be its anniversary. I decided that the event should be celebrated with all the pomp our situation would allow. The next day, we dressed as well as we could in our scanty clothing. We could spend the time in songs and play, with the boys competing in all kinds of games. The first contest would be shooting. I set up a wooden marker, which we called a kangaroo. Jack did wonders, shooting away one of the ears of our pretend kangaroo. Then I threw a piece of cork in the air, and the boys shot at it. Ernest did best, shooting the ball to pieces, but Jack could not hit it this time. I complimented all the boys on the progress they had made since last year. Next came a running race, for which I gave them a course over Family Bridge and to Falcon's Nest. The one that arrives first, I said, will bring me, as proof, my knife which I left on the table under the tree. I then gave the signal by clapping my hands. My 3 older sons set out, Jack and Fritz with all the speed they could. Ernest, who never did anything without thinking, ran slowly at first. He was careful, and it might win him the race. The runners were gone about 3/4 of an hour, 45 minutes. Jack returned first, but he was mounted on the buffalo. The donkeys Grizzle and Lightfoot followed behind. "What's this?" I said. "It was your legs and not those of the buffalo that I wished to exercise." "Bah!" cried Jack. "I knew I would never get there first, so I left the course. I guessed the riding race would be next, so I thought I would bring our mounts back with me." Fritz came second, all out of breath and covered with sweat, but he didn't have the knife. It was Ernest who brought it to me. "Fritz left first and arrived back before you. So how do you come to have the knife, Ernest?" I asked. "It's simple," answered Ernest. "On the way there, Fritz couldn't keep up his fast pace and soon stopped for breath, while I ran on and got the knife. But in coming back, Fritz had learned a lesson. He paced himself as I had before. Since he's 16 and I'm only 13, he got here first." I praised both boys for their skill and declared Ernest the winner. But now Jack, mounted on the buffalo, demanded that the riding exercises begin so he can make up for his loss. To the saddle, he bellowed with all his force. Fritz mounted Lightfoot and Ernest took Grizzle. But although they tried, Jack beat them both. He was bold. To stop, charge, and turn was but a trifle to him. Just as I had declared the contest over and was about to proclaim Jack victor, little Francis rode into the arena. Mounted on a young bull who was not more than 3 or 4 months of age. My wife had made him a saddle. Gentlemen, said the little rider, saluting us with a pretend bow, I haven't competed yet. Let me show you what I can do. We all loudly applauded him as Francis began his show. The boy was more cool and calm than most his age. He had also managed to tame the bull quite completely, with help from Elizabeth, who looked on proudly. We all proclaimed Francis an excellent rider. After the riding came swimming, climbing trees, and gymnastics. Then I announced that the rewards would be distributed and the victors would be crowned. Everyone hastened to the grotto, which had been lighted up with torches. Elizabeth gave out gifts from among the things we had taken so long ago from the shipwreck, along with a kiss on the forehead. Ernest, conqueror at shooting and swimming, received a superb English rifle and a hunting knife. Fritz got a splendid gold pocket watch. Jack, the best rider, was given a magnificent pair of steel spurs and a whip made out of whalebone. Little Francis received a pair of stirrups and a box of paints. I then gave Elizabeth a beautiful English sewing box. The day was finished as it had begun, with joyful songs. Chapter 9. Our Second Winter. When a full season had again run its course, we found ourselves once more faced with the rainy season. But this year we were far better prepared. We had spent a year cultivating crops of all sorts: potatoes, corn, wheat, rice, guavas, sweet acorns, pineapples, anise, and manioc plants. We had set up stores of meats. Our livestock would be well provided for in our warm, dry grotto. The rains had already started by the time we finished all our work. The horizon became covered with thick clouds. The wind swept fearfully along the coast. The trees bent to the terrible blasts of wind. It seemed to us that the storms of last year had been nothing compared to this. After 2 weeks, the winds began to calm. The rain fell more gently, but we knew it would keep up for 12 long weeks. At the beginning, we were sad at being stuck inside all day, but we soon began to arrange our new home cheerfully. We made tables and chairs and lit our home with lanterns. We used mirrors everywhere to reflect the light, and soon the grotto was as bright as sunlight. Fritz and I worked together in the workroom. Jack helped his mother in the kitchen. Ernest and Francis arranged the books we had saved from the wreck into a library. Among these books were works of history, botany, philosophy, voyages and travels, and grammars and dictionaries of different nations. There were also maps and a portable globe. We all knew German and a little French from our native land of Switzerland. But we began to study English, the language of the sea, for I knew that most ships had at least a few sailors who spoke it. Jack also started learning Spanish and Italian. As for myself, I tried to master the Malay tongue, for the charts and maps convinced me we were in the neighborhood of these people. Our grotto became so comfortable that the children couldn't think of any name they liked better than the Fairy Palace. But after a long discussion, we decided to call it the Felsenheim, which means dwelling in the rock. In German, our native tongue. Soon the bad weather renewed itself. The rain, the winds, the thunder redoubled with fury. How happy we were in our home! What would have become of us in our high palace at Falcon's Nest? But at last the weather became calm. The clouds disappeared. The rain stopped. We were able to leave our grotto. We walked up the stretch of rocks along the coast and took pleasure in climbing the highest peaks. Then we emptied out the rain from the canoe I had made before winter and explored some more. On an island in the middle of the bay, we found an enormous whale lying on the beach. Our whale looked like those of Greenland. The back was greenish black, the stomach yellowish, and the fins and tail black. It was about 60 or 70 feet long. Its eyes were not much larger than those of an ox. Fritz and Jack entered the head of the whale and cut out the whalebone from the mouth. Meanwhile, Ernest and I collected the whale's blubber. We could use the fat for oil to make light and heat. But we were soon joined by birds, which were also attracted to the whale. They flew round and round our heads. Soon they were boldly snatching pieces of blubber from our hands. When we had taken all we wanted, we abandoned the rest of the whale to them. Everything was placed in our canoe, and we set sail for Felsenheim with our precious new cargo. The next day we strained the whale blubber for oil, then cooked the rest of it to get out as much oil as possible. We worked far from Felsenheim because of the terrible odor. Later, Elizabeth suggested making a new colony on Whale Island, as we had begun to call it. We'll put some fowls there, she said. They'll be safe from the monkeys and the jackals. We can also plant some sugar cane and some roots on the island. I liked the idea very much, and so did the children. But rather than working, when we arrived on the island, the children ran off to the beach to gather shells. Elizabeth and I were left to put her plan into action. Meanwhile, Fritz and Ernest had discovered a monstrous turtle. It was too big for them to turn over, and Ernest was struggling with it, holding onto one of its legs. It was about to escape when I arrived, using spikes as levers. Fritz and I were able to turn the turtle onto its back. It was about 8.5 feet long and couldn't weigh less than 500 pounds. I didn't know how we'd be able to carry it home. Then it came to me. Zounds, I said, striking my forehead. We won't carry the turtle home. We'll let it carry us. We tied reins to the turtle's shell and attached the barrels to its back so it couldn't dive underwater and draw us down with it. Then we tied the canoe to the turtle and it led us home. Ernest compared us to Neptune, the sea god, gliding over the waves drawn by dolphins. We arrived safely at Felsenheim. Chapter 10: A Dangerous Visitor. One day, from outside our grotto, we saw a cloud of dust arise from the direction of Falcon's Nest. Fritz, whose eagle eye was always making discoveries, said, "There is some large animal there. I can see it plainly. It has a greenish-colored body. What do you think it is, Papa?" I ran for the spyglass and looked towards the dust. A serpent! A huge snake coming directly for us. Shall I run for the guns? No, we must get to safety. The serpent is too powerful for us to attack it from here. We hurried to the entry of the grotto and prepared to meet our enemy. It was a boa constrictor. We watched it stretch its enormous length along the bank of the river. From time to time, it would raise up the front part of its body off the ground and turn its head as if seeking prey. It darted its triple barbed tongue with its half-open jaws. The serpent crossed Family Bridge and headed straight for the grotto. We barricaded the door and the windows. We passed our muskets through the door and waited silently for the enemy. It was a silence of terror. The boa stopped about 30 paces from our home. Ernest, more out of fear than anger, fired his gun. Elizabeth, Jack, and Francis followed his example. The serpent raised its head, but either none of the shots had touched it, or the scales of its skin were too tough. It glided away with unbelievable speed toward the marsh where our ducks and geese lived, and soon it disappeared in the rushes. Fear of the serpent kept us shut out for 3 days. 3 long days of fear and alarm. We knew it hadn't left because each evening the whole colony of ducks and geese would sail away for Whale Island, where it was safe. We were in a terrible state until Grizzle, our poor old donkey, came to us to help. Grizzle got loose and pushed open the door. He shot off like an arrow and was away in the open plain before we could stop him. It was a funny sight to see him kicking his heels in the air. Fritz would have mounted Lightfoot and ridden out after Grizzle, but I wouldn't let him. I tried to coax Grizzle back by calling his name and blowing our cow horn, but it was useless. He ran directly towards the swampy marsh. Horror froze our veins when we saw that awful serpent emerging from the rushes. It raised its head, darted out its forked tongue, and crawled quickly toward the donkey. Poor Grizzle soon saw the danger and began to run, braying with all his might. But neither his cries nor his legs could save him. We uttered cries of terror. Our donkey was dead. We had heard its last bray. Afterwards, the serpent lay perfectly still and asleep. I saw that now the time had come, and finally I explained, "Now, my children, now the serpent is in our power." Fritz, Jack, Ernest, and I set out from the grotto carrying our guns. The serpent raised its head and, throwing me a look of powerless anger, let it fall again. We advanced nearer and fired our pistols. The serpent lay dead upon the sand before us, stretched out like the mast of a ship. Chapter 11. A New Land. We had nothing more to fear from the boa constrictor, but I was afraid it might have left behind a mate or a nest of little ones. These could spread terror through our lands. I decided to take a trip through the passage in the rock where I supposed the boa had gotten through. We set out, loaded with our hunting gear. We passed through the gap in the rocky cliff that marked the edge of the land we had explored so well. We had been that way only once before, when we had almost been trampled by a herd of buffaloes. We could easily trace the spiral track of the boa in the sand. Later, I intended to build a solid wall here so that no other serpents or dangerous animals could get through. As we traveled, we recognized the place where we had taken the buffalo. As we advanced farther, the plants became fewer and fewer until we found ourselves in the middle of an immense desert. The sun beat down on our heads, and the sand burned our feet. After 2 hours of painful walking, we arrived at the foot of a hill. Because it was so high, it offered a little shade. There, we rested from the overpowering rays of the sun and ate a small meal to keep up our strength. But we didn't rest for long. Soon Fritz spied something moving. Great, graceful birds. ostriches. We agreed to capture one and bring it home. It would look beautiful among our domestic animals. We hid behind some large tufts of a plant and waited for the ostriches to come our way. But our dogs sprang forward and attacked them. Away flew the birds as fast as a bundle of feathers being blown by the wind. Their feet seemed not to touch the ground, and their wings looked like sails. But the dogs kept after them and attacked the largest bird, a male. We ran to save him, but when we arrived, he was already dying from the wounds the dogs had given him. We were sorry for what had happened, but we could not do anything about it. We pulled the white tail feathers from the dead ostrich and placed them proudly in our hats. The rich feathers contrasted our old, worn-out beaver hats, but they were excellent protection against the rays of the sun. Jack and Ernest went on ahead of Fritz and me. Soon they seemed to make some great discovery, for we saw them waving their plumed hats and heard them shouting to us to hurry. "A nest," they cried, "an ostrich nest! Quick, quick!" We ran to them and found the two boys standing over a large hole in the ground. In it were some 25 to 30 eggs, each as large as a child's head. My sons wanted to hatch them by exposing them to the rays of the sun and then wrapping them up as warmly as possible at night. I replied that each of the eggs weighed about 3 pounds and that we were already so loaded down we could hardly drag our knapsacks across the desert. Besides, the sun's warmth would never replace the care of the adult ostriches. But the children insisted. Each took one egg. We walked until we passed from the desert into a great swamp. We could see in the distance troops of buffaloes, monkeys, and antelopes. There were no signs of any boas. We stopped at this marsh and refreshed ourselves with some food. We also filled our empty gourds with water. We left the borders of the swamp to return home, following a little stream of water. It led us through an oasis in the desert, filled with trees and grass. How delicious this route was compared with our painful journey in the morning. But scarcely had we gotten comfortable when Ernest, who had walked on ahead, let out a terrible cry. I heard 2 howls. The dogs barked. A moment later, Ernest appeared running, his face pale. He cried out in a voice stifled with fear, "Bears! Bears! They're following me!" And the poor boy fell into my arms. I myself was seized with a sudden shiver as an enormous bear appeared, immediately followed by a second one. "Courage, children," was all I could say. I seized my gun and prepared to fight. We fired, wounding the bears, but not killing them. The dogs fought, bravely too, rolling in the dust with the bears. We would have fired again, but we were afraid we would hit the dogs. We crept closer. About 4 paces from the bears, we fired. The huge animals fell back, motionless on the sand. We drew the bears into a nearby cave and covered them with thorn bushes to keep off the beasts and birds of prey. We also buried our ostrich eggs in the sand. They were too heavy to carry, and this would keep them safe until we could pick them up the next day. Then we continued on our way home. The sun had set when we rejoined my dear Elizabeth and little Francis. A very good fire and a well-cooked supper refreshed our weary bodies. My little heroes told the long story of our day's adventures. Jack made up for the small share he had in our story by boasting and swaggering enough for all. We returned to the cave the next day to skin the bears for fur. I divided the meat into long strips, which we smoked. We left the remains for the birds of prey, who soon picked the bones so clean that they remained nothing but two perfectly white skeletons. These we carried home for us for our museum. As for the ostrich eggs, Ernest made cups out of them. In the cave, I also found several minerals, including a superb block of talc, as transparent as glass. I decided to turn it into window panes for our home. Ernest helped me, and we soon cut off a splendid piece big enough for our job. We would divide it into leaves no thicker than paper. Elizabeth was overjoyed. Anything that reminded her of Switzerland made her happy. It had taken us most of the day to do all this. As night approached, we gathered around our fire, where Elizabeth was cooking stew. The smell that escaped from the pot promised us a delicious supper. All that was left to complete this adventure was the building of a solid wall across the gap in the rocks where the snake had come from. It was hard work, and it occupied us for more than a month. When we relaxed from our work, the boys would wander off and always bring us home something useful. It was not too many days later when Fritz suggested a new project. We should build a fort on Shark Island in case of danger. His head was so full of plans that it was impossible to say no, and we soon began the work. Our goal was to bring the two cannons we had saved from the ship to the island, build a platform more than 50 feet high, and mount them there. But how would we raise up the cannons? We built a tall tower on top of the platform and attached a long rope, tied the cannons on, and hauled them up. This work cost us a whole day of hard labor. At last, the cannons were mounted, their mouths pointing toward the sea. We placed a long pole in the rock with a string and pulley so we could sail a flag. How proud we felt! We uttered a cry of joy, even though we had to save our gunpowder. We made a special celebration and fired our cannons 6 times. The rocks and the ocean echoed with the sand. Chapter 12, which is going to be the last one for today. A great treasure. It is with amazement that I look at the number of pages I have written. Every day I write even more. 10 years have passed away since we were thrown on this island. Each year was much like the last. We had our fields to sow, our harvest to gather, and our home life to attend to. It was our good luck to land in one of the most lush and beautiful lands on the planet. We were always able to provide for all our needs, but we still missed our homeland, our own dear Switzerland. Over the years, we made many improvements. In front of our grotto, we built a gallery with a roof that rested on the columns made of light bamboo. Vines of vanilla and pepper grew up the columns, making them as picturesque as a Chinese pavilion. Shark Island was no longer a dry bank of sand. We had planted palm and pineapple trees everywhere, and the earth was a carpet of green. Our Swiss flag floated gaily in the breeze atop the flagpole of our fort. Our gardens and plantations had grown tremendously. Between the grotto and the bay was a grove of trees and shrubs as beautiful as an English garden. Our European trees had grown with incredible speed, but their fruits had lost their flavor. Perhaps it was not the right kind of soil, or perhaps it was the salt air. But the apples and pears became black and withered. On the other hand, the native plants thrived. Bananas, figs, guavas, oranges, and lemons made our island a complete paradise. We lacked for nothing. If only we could have found other people. My sons were no longer children. Fritz was 25 years of age, not tall, yet very strong from all the exercise. Ernest was 22, healthy, but not as broad as his older brother. He had always loved to study and was now a well-informed young man, smart and bright. Jack was as headstrong at the age of 20 as he had been at 10. He was the strongest and the quickest. Francis was 16. He was solid and tall, agile and skillful. They were all honest, good-hearted men. My dear Elizabeth did not seem to have grown old. As for me, my hair had become whitened by age. What little was left, but I still felt young. One day, Fritz gave us a great scare. He went off in his canoe and traveled far out to sea. As night approached, nothing could be seen of him. Elizabeth was in a state of great terror. I set out after him in the pinnace, heading for Shark Island. From there, we fired an alarm cannon. A few moments later, we saw a black spot in the far distance. We looked through the spyglass and saw Fritz's craft. He moved slowly, beating the sea with his oars, as if his canoe were very heavy. Soon he had returned to us safe and sound. He announced, "I have made a discovery more to us than all the treasures on the earth." Fritz brought on shore his sack and recounted his adventures. "The weather was beautiful and the waves peaceful," he began. "Seabirds flew all around me, uttering piercing cries. Sea lions, sea elephants, and walruses played on the rocks, bellowing frightfully. I passed into a magnificent bay with clear waters. On the bottom were beds of large oysters, much bigger and better than the ones we have gathered here at home. But when I opened some to try them, I didn't find a nice fat oyster, but only some little round hard stones, like peas. They were pearls. I filled a little box with them. I examined the stones. 'You have discovered a treasure, my son,' I agreed." Fritz continued, "As I started to leave the bay, marine animals about the size of cows began to plunge and frisk around my boat. I was afraid they would turn it over, so I attacked the first one that came near me. The others fled. The animal's skin was thick and I thought it would be useful. I jumped onto a nearby rock and began to skin it. But while I was doing this, seabirds clustered around me. They came so close that I whirled my staff around to keep them away. In doing so, I knocked down a large bird, an albatross. I loaded the skin into my boat and returned home. All rejoiced at a safe return. But when my wife and younger boys went off to unload the animal skin from the boat, Fritz drew me aside and confided a secret in my ear. 'Something very important happened on my voyage,' he said. 'The albatross I knocked down had a piece of linen tied around one of its feet. On it were written in English words, "Save the poor shipwrecked sailor on the rock." I can't express to you, Father, what I felt. I read and reread the words to make sure I wasn't dreaming. From that moment, my only thought has been to save the sailor.' I wrote another note and attached the linen back on the albatross. The note said, 'Help is near.' If the bird returns to the place it came from, the sailor can read my answer. If we should find the unfortunate one, what joy, what happens? And yet, what despair if we don't succeed? That's why I didn't tell my brothers and my mother, to spare them the agony if we should fail." "You have acted wisely," I said, "and I am glad you didn't go immediately to look for the sailor. You'll need help and provisions. As for our chances of success, the albatross is quite a traveler. The linen might have been put on his foot thousands of miles from here or years ago, but we will certainly try. That's it for today. And what happens next, we'll find out tomorrow. I hope you'll join me tomorrow at 4. It's going to be, we only have a little bit left of the book, so I'm going to finish it tomorrow at 4 o'clock. So see you then, and thanks for joining.